they were refused access to a bathroom. The 3 children were found at the time by law enforcement to be in diapers.
A Florida children's book author admitted in court that she brutally abused her adopted children for years. And the abuse only came to light when one of her children was brought to the emergency room in absolutely dire condition. But the amount of time she and her husband will spend in prison for their horrific crimes, you may not agree with. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Well, it's official. 45-year-old Jennifer and 43-year-old Joseph Wolfthal of Seminole County, Florida, are going to prison. Why? Well, they both entered guilty pleas on Monday, and that was the day that trial was supposed to get underway because both were accused of viciously abusing their adopted children. This is a horrific case. They ended up pleading guilty to aggravated child abuse, neglect of a child causing great bodily harm charges. WESH2 has reported that the prosecution actually agreed to drop 3 other charges, kidnapping, false imprisonment charges, in order to secure this deal. We'll talk about if it's a deal or not. But I mean, this is a couple that face more than 100 years in prison if a jury had found them guilty. And for good reason, because as you can imagine, what we're about to get into, just to give you a warning right now, is disgusting. We're going to discuss the appalling treatment of these children, as well as their graphic injuries. You know I don't like talking about these cases, but it's important to talk about nonetheless, to kind of give a view of what is going on in this world. Now, again, just to give you a heads up about what we're about to get into, this is difficult subject matter. So with that in mind, Jennifer and Joseph's arrest reports have been revealed, and they lay out what investigators discovered on New Year's Day 2021. That's the day that Joseph had apparently brought one of their adopted children to the hospital, and this child was in really bad shape. I'm going to read from the arrest report paperwork to give you an understanding of what these children were going through, how the authorities arrived at the charges that they did, and also we'll get an understanding of the prosecution choosing to proceed with a plea agreement here. Now, before I do all that, I want to bring in former child abuse prosecutor and professor of law, Marian Braccia. Marian, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. First of all, before we even get into the details of all this, do we typically see guilty pleas in these kinds of cases where some of the charges are taken off the table?
I think it is a fairly common occurrence, Jesse, because, as you know, such a high percentage of cases, both on the civil side and on the criminal side, are settled with non-trial dispositions. So some kind of guilty plea or agreement beforehand. So this is not an unusual outcome for the case, and I'm sure that some considerations were made regarding the welfare of the children and what impact it would have on them to have to be involved or have to cooperate or participate in the prosecution. So it's not a surprising outcome for me.
And I want to keep that in mind because there's a statement that comes out later on where you can kind of get a sense of why this didn't go to trial, or there was an effort to make sure this didn't go to trial. So, by the way, as we get into this, I just want to note something. The children's genders and ages, they are redacted from the arrest reports, but McClatchy News, which is this nationwide syndicate, reports that an 8-year-old girl, an 11-year-old girl, and a 9-year-old boy, these are the children we're talking about. They were all removed from the Wolfthal home. So here's what we know. A Seminole County deputy who responded to the hospital was able to see, again, this reportedly 8-year-old girl's injuries and speak with staff at the pediatric ICU. Jennifer's arrest report states, quote, she has multiple internal failures and clearly visible external lacerations, bruises, abrasions, and scabs. Specifically, there is an abrasion that encircles her neck and upper back area that is red and bleeding and contains some scabbing, as if it had partially healed and then been re-injured. She also displayed 2 blackened and bruised eyes, as well as a severe laceration to her lip and at least 1 chipped tooth. Across her entire body were apparent signs of a lack of care. Specifically, on her right lower leg, there were infected sores that ruptured and produced fluid when examined by the medical staff. I was unable to speak to her due to the fact that she was unconscious and being supported by a ventilator. It should be noted that she weighs only approximately 40 pounds, which is very underweight. By the way, what do sidebar stories like this one prove? Maybe that the world can be incredibly scary and unpredictable. And I'll tell you what, when you think about that, one of the scariest and most unpredictable things that can happen to you in life is if you get injured, right? That comes out of nowhere. That is very, very scary. But that is where Morgan & Morgan, the exclusive personal injury law firm of Law&Crime, comes in. So they're a firm with over 1,000 attorneys who will help to fight for what you deserve. I mean, in the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $29 million verdict for a bicyclist in Philadelphia, a $2.7 million verdict for a car accident victim in Florida, not to mention $5.6 million for a car crash victim in Georgia after insurance offered that client $0. And Morgan & Morgan makes it truly so simple because you can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC-Sidebar. So Marian, you know, we see many times in these cases, the defenses will be, well, you know, young children, the injuries could be caused by them roughhousing, playing around, falling down. It's not unusual that children have all these injuries. Talk to me, though, about why an investigator, why law enforcement would look at this, why prosecutors would look at this and say, that doesn't work here.
Right. It doesn't work because of the extent of the injuries. You know, children fall down, they're unsteady, they're rambunctious, they bump themselves. Sure, they get bruises and get banged up as they're playing, either by themselves or with each other, or when they're jumping off of furniture. So that's all very very normal childhood behavior and childhood play. I think what alerted law enforcement to some potential foul play here was the fact that these injuries appeared to have been healed over, which tells us that there was a course of conduct, which tells us that there was an opportunity for the injuries to heal, and then there was some other trauma, some other impact that caused new or more serious or reinforced injuries, if you will. And so that tells us that this wasn't a one-time occurrence, that this was episodic, that this was happening over a period of time. And if such serious injuries are happening over a period of time, that tells us that it's not just a kid tripping and falling one time for having lost their balance. This is actually something that, as I said, is a course of conduct.
So here's what happened. Okay, the deputy speaks with Joseph at the hospital, obviously demanding to know how his adopted daughter ended up like this, right? Well, according to the arrest report, it reads, he told me that on Monday of this week, she had injured her mouth by brushing her teeth too hard and caused some bleeding in her mouth. On Tuesday, he told me that he noticed some facial swelling and administered her some Motrin. He also said that later on Tuesday, she was being wobbly and, in his words, maybe experiencing some vertigo. After some discussion, he told me that he didn't actually see her fall on 3 different occasions that day, but that his wife, Jennifer L. Wolfthal, had explained what had happened. According to Joseph, Jennifer said that she had fallen once in her bedroom and landed on her butt, and then in 2 separate incidents, she fell in the bathroom and hit her face on the toilet, and then a short time later, she allegedly fell again, striking her head on the side of her wooden desk. Joseph continued to tell me that he felt like she was acting better on Wednesday, so he was not concerned for her well-being. On Thursday, she would not eat, was having difficulty using the bathroom, and seemed very lethargic. Joseph then told me that this morning the couple contacted their parents and asked for advice, at which time they transported her to the hospital emergency room. Now, Joseph went on to tell police that he was away at work for 10 or more hours a day, and during that time, it was Jennifer who was the sole caregiver for these 3 children. He also told the deputy that even when he was home, Jennifer was the disciplinarian. He even claimed that she hurt him, once allegedly punching him in the chest and knocking him to the ground. Another time, she allegedly locked him in the laundry room as a timeout. So Joseph admitted that he was fearful of his wife. Now, Marian, I look at that and I think that's really strategic here, right? Your reaction to this, where it's this idea of, you know, this a husband, it's not the first time I've seen it, putting the blame on the wife, the girlfriend, the significant other. She's the one watching the children day in and day out. I don't know what's going on.
Right. So, and I think that's what makes child abuse cases, and in particular conspiracy cases, very, very tricky. Because with conspiracy, you have to prove that there was some agreement between the actors ahead of time to engage in some criminal behavior. There needs to be some meeting of the minds ahead of time. How can we prove that? will there ever have been a documented, recorded conversation of husband and wife talking to each other and saying, hey, let's do these heinous things to our adopted children? Of course not. So we have to prove through circumstantial evidence that these two knew what they were doing, knew what the other were doing, and they had come to an agreement beforehand to engage in this behavior. The other challenge of child abuse cases, especially when there's more than one actor, more than one caregiver, is the question of access. So who was alone with the children a majority of the time? When were they together? What was the division of childcare responsibilities? Who was responsible for discipline? Who was responsible for mealtime, for feeding, for bedtime, for bathing? And so these are the questions. And so this is, I think, a pretty typical defense strategy is to kind of cross fingers and say, it wasn't my responsibility, my partner, my spouse was responsible for that. It wasn't my responsibility, it was the other person who was responsible for that. So there's a lot of finger pointing and back and forthing, which is perhaps an effective defense, but it is a tremendous challenge for the prosecution to show, no, these two were acting in concert. Of course they knew, each knew what the other was doing, and there was an agreement to treat these children as such.
Yeah, there might be a situation where if you have a significant other who's traveling all the time, comes home for a few hours, doesn't recognize the state of the children, doesn't see the children, that might fly. But given the severity of these injuries, and we'll talk more about what these injuries are, and it doesn't appear that Jennifer just did this on her own, that it seems Joseph was an active participant as well. I mean, you can't just turn a blind eye, and you being fearful of your wife and maybe not questioning her or not saying what you think, that's not a legal defense.
It's not a legal defense to say I had nothing to do with this criminal behavior because I was afraid of my alleged co-conspirator, unless, of course, there's a defense of duress, that he was acting under extreme pressure, that she was threatening him, that he would be in physical harm or in physical danger unless he engaged in this kind of abuse with the children. But I don't see that as a likely fact pattern here.
No. So what happens next in the story? So the deputy then sends first responders, deputies, fire crew, child protective investigators over to the Wolfthal home immediately. And that is when two more children were found. And they were found to be malnourished. They too were covered in bruises, and they were taken to the hospital for evaluation. Now, the arrest report also notes that sometime between the first responders checking on the kids and Jennifer being arrested, she apparently cleaned up the house. Authorities could smell this strong scent of ammonia that hadn't been there before. Marian, real quick, your reaction to that?
I think that smacks of what we call under the jury instructions consciousness of guilt. It's cleaning up a crime scene. It's trying to clean up your tracks, to erase your tracks, so that there can be little or no evidence found of what had transpired in that physical setting.
And talk about what transpired. According to authorities, these children were treated for various different injuries and conditions. We're talking staph infection, sepsis, renal and liver failure, open infected wounds on their legs, pneumonia, malnutrition. So investigators from the Kids House Advocacy Center, they sit down with two of these children. And Marian, first of all, these are important but tough conversations to have, right? Investigators, they have to have specific training on how to get that information, elicit that information from children about what is very tough subject matter, right?
It is. It is very. It's a very specialized training. These are forensic interviews. To be perfectly honest, if an investigator or even a parent or a caregiver isn't trained in having these very particular conversations, they probably shouldn't, because of the risk of re-traumatizing a child and asking them questions about an abusive or traumatic incident when the interviewer or the questioner doesn't have the training to ask such specific questions. So yes, these are very, very specialized interviews, and the psychologists who are responsible for doing child forensic interviews are real heroes in the world of child abuse prosecution. Incredible heroes,
incredible heroes. This is not an easy task. But now it becomes the question, what did the children say? Well, one of the children started off by saying that her parents were, quote, not nice, and that, quote, both Joseph and Jennifer would spank her in the same spot to the point of drawing blood. Both utilized a specific item that was described as being oblong and covered with fabric that was used regularly to deliver corporal punishment. The child called it a whacker. According to her mother, she couldn't stop sinning, which was later learned was what she was told any time that she was punished. She said that she would be punished for not going to the bathroom at the proper times, wetting the bed, not performing her exercises properly, not eating what was provided for her. I learned that her exercises were squats that she would have to perform in her room standing near her desk. The food was a mixture of bran flake cereal, water, and vegetable puree. She said that there were days that she was fed twice, and sometimes she didn't finish her first meal until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By the way, this is very reminiscent of the Ruby Franke case out of Utah, for all of those of you who remember that case. We covered it here on Sidebar. But this goes on. She told us that she spent the entire day writing sentences at her desk in her room. It should be noted that pursuant to a search warrant, I located over 1,100 paragraphs written that stated, "My body stays flat on the bed at all times. I was never given permission to move or say anything. Now I get to write about this along with everything else. I'm a fool." Both children said that the main punishment occurred almost every night. They would have cold water poured over them as they lay in bed. Neither bed had any bedding and consisted only of a plastic mattress cover and pillow. One child said that she would have to drink some of the water from the puddle around her face so that she had room to breathe. The child also said that Joseph would stand there and watch this take place but would not help her. Additionally, she said that she would not be allowed a blanket, and there would be a box fan on the floor to act as additional cooling or drumming, and a noise to cover so that she could not hear the interactions between Joseph, Jennifer, and her sister. You know, Marian, aside from how absolutely heinous this is, you have to wonder, how do these children ever recover, not only physically, but psychologically, mentally from this?
I think that is ultimately the question, that the abuse isn't just something that happens at the date, time, and location where the abuse is alleged, that these scars will, these psychological scars will last and can last a lifetime. How do these children come into a new household? I know that they've been relocated, that there was a new family now, but how do they come into any relationship with trust that they will be safe, that they will be cared for, that they will be nurtured, that they won't misstep and have a bedwetting accident or commit a sin, quote unquote, and end up being punished or disciplined the way that they thought they were being disciplined. We know they were being abused. So this trauma will not end anytime soon.
No. And these children told the detectives that they hadn't interacted with any other adults for years. Now, all three children, they're now out of the hospital. They're reportedly doing well after being placed with another family. So having said all of that, and knowing that the pair faced more than 100 years in prison as a potential punishment, what was their sentence? 10 years for Joseph, 12 years for Jennifer. Marian, is that justice?
Well, I think that we need to look at what the prosecutors were considering, and I think we need to consider what else was on the table, so to speak. So in order to proceed to trial, what would the prosecutors have needed? They likely would have needed the testimony from all three children, which would have meant bringing these kids into court, swearing them in, having them in an open public forum, likely with a jury. So we're talking about 12 new sets of eyes, strangers who are picking them apart, examining them, and they would have to face their two abusers because, of course, the two defendants have a confrontation right. They have a right to hear what their accusers are saying about them or saying what happened to them. So when you think about that scenario, that physical setting, how re-traumatizing is that for a child to have to come in and relive in graphic detail all of the things that happened to them over this period of time? And of course, sequestration would have been in effect, so their siblings wouldn't have been in the room to kind of lend that support or that sympathy during the testimony process. This is a very alienating and scary process, not just for children, but for anybody who's not familiar with the court system. So I am quite sure that the prosecutors were considering that trauma that the children would have to re-endure by coming in and testifying. We can talk about whether the length of the sentence is just, whether that will properly protect society. I think what we need to ask is, are these people, are the two defendants likely to reoffend? So let's consider that. How old will they be when they're released from prison? Is it likely that they will have children when they are released from prison? They will have child abuse on their record for the rest of their lives. They will not be able to adopt or to foster children or to teach in schools or to have anything to do with children.
I hear you, but I guess the counter argument that is, look what they did to these kids. And yes, the kidnapping, false imprisonment charges were dropped. Great win for them. 10 years, 12 years, right? Like, you're looking at that and you're thinking, you have damaged kids potentially for the rest of their lives. Why should you get out, with maybe, in their 60s, if I'm doing the math right, or something like that? I mean, you still have a life to live. I know that this could have been a situation where we want to offer them something that is somewhat of an incentive for them to plead guilty. So the idea that they will eventually be released, sure. But at the same token, it's like you think to yourself, is that justice to have those other charges dropped, to have them potentially be released and have a life to live? And look, you're right. The state attorney's office said they had spoken with the family that's now caring for the children, and everyone agreed that the plea deal was the best way to go because it, quote, ensures that the Wolfthals will spend significant time in prison while it protects the already traumatized victims from the stress of having to testify. You're right. I just look at the amount of time that they're going away, and I think a lot of people look at it and say, that doesn't seem just considering what these kids now have to go through for the rest of their lives.
Well, I think, and I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm certainly not defending and saying, 10 years is sufficient. That's the going price for a child abuse case. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But I think what we're doing in this conversation is kind of calling into question then the very philosophy behind our system of punishment, right?
Sure.
What punishment is enough? Can you ever really take away the trauma that these children suffered? What amount of prison time will take that away? Can any amount take that away? Of course not. If this were, we're all very, very relieved that the children are on their way to recovery, at least physical recovery. But if this were a different outcome, if this were a homicide case, what penalty would ever bring a life back? What penalty can ever truly undo a trauma? So it really is a question of, and I'm not a prison abolitionist. I'm not saying that we shouldn't incarcerate people. That's not at all what I'm saying. I guess my question is, how can we ever really calculate a just sentence to make sure that a victim is made whole? Can someone ever be made whole after they've been criminally victimized and traumatized like this?
And something that makes this even more horrific, if possible, is that Jennifer Wolfthal reportedly spent time as an educator. Yeah. And was also a children's book author. Yeah. So Jennifer wrote the book Real Friend, which is apparently still available on Amazon right now, but comes with a message from Clavis Publishing. It says, at Clavis, we believe that children are beautiful and deserve our utmost respect and care. That is why we publish books to enrich their lives and help them grow up learning to know themselves, how to interact with others in a good way, and how the world works. We were made aware of horrific news regarding one-time Clavis author Jennifer Wolfthal's arrest and strongly condemn child abuse, abandonment, and neglect today and always. We will do what's within our power to cease commercialization of her book further. Now, many people who had left positive messages about the book on the website Goodreads went back, changed their reviews. A woman named Sarah wrote, in light of charges of child abuse against the author, I can no longer recommend this book. Tiffany commented, this woman and her husband have recently been arrested for child abuse. According to the police, they starved their child, beat them to the point they bled, and left them in filthy conditions. Do not let your children read a book by such an odious and evil woman. Every word is a lie. Now, according to her bio on Amazon, Jennifer graduated from the University of Central Florida with a BA in elementary education. For the next 8 years, taught 4th grade in public school. Just think about that for a second. And as for Joseph Wolfthal, well, his occupation on his arrest report was listed as engineer at Lockheed Martin. What a case. Marian Braccia, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time as always.
Thanks, Jesse. Good to see you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.